So now let me talk then about ways of bringing the urban forest into cities. When we know that we need cities that are more resilient, that are healthier, that are greener, how can we do that? Because as you know, of course, also for many cities in India, including Mumbai, space comes at a premium. There's often not much room to actually put an extra tree. Sometimes nature does take over and you see spontaneous vegetation popping up. But sometimes we have to be a little bit more strategic about where do we bring in forests and trees and how do we do that? So let me take you to a few models that I've been using in my work of how to do that. Infilling with forest, using reclaimed land to plant forests, maybe putting trees and forest on an elevation, maybe putting them on buildings even, or transplanting them. And of course, also still we have to think about our wild forests and how to maintain them in a good way. And then finally, let me talk a little bit about imaginative forests, or even maybe imaginary forests, to really make sure that we keep combining, keep connecting people and forest in today's society. Let's start with infill forest, which may be a bit more one of the classic ways of how we try to do urban forestry. So in places like China, there has been quite some efforts to maybe sometimes even take away some of the buildings and some of the industry, and then to repurpose these areas with parks like the one you see here on the picture. Often these parks have multiple benefits, so they are there for recreation. They also are there, for example, for stormwater regulation or even for climate change or climate mitigation. So this is in Texarkana in the United States. So here you see an old shop window, shop front, and you can already see behind the shop window actually they've put in a small park. Right? Maybe not so many trees, there could have been more trees, but these kind of pocket parks or small plots where we actually start greening, you will see in many different places across the world these days. So where in the old days, I think trees and nature were still always losing out basically. You see, today it's more and more common to start thinking, okay, what can we do to actually bring nature in and to create this added value, to create this more resilient local environment? And one of the ways to do this, and I know this is also actually quite big in India, is to try to think about the connection between trees and food. And we do quite some work in Vancouver on this idea of food forestry. So one of my doctoral students, Haewon Park, who is originally from Korea, she has been looking at what does it mean to actually convert maybe some green spaces into food forestry? What are the benefits, but also what are some of the trade-offs? What motivates people to grow food and to have food crops and food trees in an urban area? So some emerging research here on this aspect. And of course, food is a really great way of getting people to connect to each other. Food is really a unifier in that sense. So it could be a good way in community gardens and in food forests to have communities connect to each other and talk and get to know each other. So this is an example actually from India. Of course, the famous Miyawaki approach, this kind of tiny forest approach, is becoming pretty widespread also in India. The idea that you can actually use relatively small areas to still grow a forest by planting very densely, so trees grow fast, you get a very rich ecosystem, and then maybe over time starting to manage that system for the different benefits it provides. And it changes idea a little bit of what a forest is and how much space we need for it. So an interesting approach, I think. It's not always suitable for every site, but as we go along, you see more and more developments also in this method. But having said that, of course, it's not easy to always retrofit. This is Hong Kong, where I used to work and live for a little bit. Try to find a place here to put a tree. Right? Maybe on top of those buildings, actually, could be one of the options. And sometimes we can reclaim land, we can repurpose land for planting trees. This is in Seoul, in Korea, on the picture here, where they used a garbage dump, a garbage tip, and re-greened it into the World Cup Park, which was created for the World Cup football, soccer in 2002. A big area with a hill in the middle where the garbage dump used to be, which is really adding a whole different value now to the city. But this is in Tulsa, Tulsa, Oklahoma, where they use part of the riverfront, which used to be industrial, and they created some extra land, and then they created this really nice new park called the Gathering Place on top of it, which is now this free resource for the community, actually fully funded from private and foundation money, because the city itself didn't have the funding for this. This project, I think, was like $150 million US project. So, of course, obviously, you have to have the funds to create these big green spaces. And talking about funds, many of you are familiar, I'm sure, with Gardens by the Bay in Singapore, this iconic new park, which is really an attractive park for tourist reasons, for nature education, etc. But actually, this is also on reclaimed land, land reclaimed from the sea. And as we know, of course, when we reclaim land from the sea, it's a pretty expensive process. So to not just put houses on it, premium apartments, but to actually create a park on it, that's actually a pretty innovative way forward. And it's paying off for Singapore because this has really become a prime destination for many people. Very popular green space. And then sometimes when you don't have the space on the ground, you can actually go up. Like here in Seoul, Korea, the Seoul 7017 project by a Dutch architect called Winnie Maas. And he created a kind of an arboretum of Korean trees on top of this old overpass structure, which was created in the 1970s. Very boring. And this is in the center of Seoul where there's really not much green space. So although it's hard for these trees to grow, of course, and it requires a lot of technical expertise, it softens the image completely of what this harsh environment actually does. And it's really a different experience when you walk between the trees. A very famous example of an elevated forest is the Highline Park in New York, created a few years ago on this old railroad structure. But of course, there are also questions here, because when you make these kind of nice parks, of course, what will happen is that prices of apartments around go up, land prices go up. So sometimes there's a risk that you push out some of the original population. That, of course, is a big risk, because you really don't want to gentrify, you don't want to push away people by greening the city. So that also means that some of my colleagues have been asking the question, how green is green enough? How far should we go in greening cities? We have to be really aware about some of the unintended consequences of greening as well. And this vertical green spaces actually are often inspired by the Coulée Vert René Dumont, which is in Paris. Very similar idea. So you have trees here in boxes that are actually on this old overpass structure. So quite a few examples of that existing around the world. And then you can even take it one step further. You can actually start planting trees on buildings. This is the vertical forest in Milan, which is starting to be an example for many of these kind of projects across the world, in Belgium, in China, in the Middle East, etc. And this is designed by an architect called Stefano Boeri, who is based in Milan in Italy. And of course, there's a lot of debate about it. Like, how is it possible? How can we have trees on buildings? This is high maintenance, obviously. There are issues with wind and water. It's not cheap, probably, to do it. But I think from a very strong symbolistic perspective, this is very innovative to say, hey, we have to really think out of the box when we develop green cities. It's not enough to just go the usual well-trodden paths. We have to really do things differently. And maybe sometimes we can get a step too far, right? This is an architect's vision of the vertical forest on Mars. Just heard, of course, that the Mars lander reached its destination, so it's a bit fitting, of course. And who knows, somewhere in the future we'll bring this vertical forest with us when we go to different planets. Another inspiring story, I feel, is that of transplanted forest, and especially here the Otomachi Tower in Tokyo. In this case, it was a very dense site in the CBD, the Central Business District of Tokyo. And those of you who know Tokyo, it's very dense, not much green space as such. There was quite a bit of issues. The city didn't maybe have the authority and not even the funding to create a new forest. So some of the big companies in the area, like Hitachi, etc., they got together and they started funding a new pocket forest, this Otomachi Tower Forest project. And rather than maybe establish it on this very harsh site, they actually had a forest grown outside of the city of Tokyo. They created an ecosystem and layers, etc. And then actually they cut that in smaller pieces and they brought it onto the site. And of course that took then some time to get established, etc. But the good thing was there was already a soil layer, there was some soil life, there was a structure in the forest. So it actually kind of led to an instant forest being created. And I've been there. It's really a wonderful experience. It really gives you, if you close your eyes and you're in there, you hear the birds and you're under the rustling leaves, you really get the impression you're in a forest. It's pretty remarkable given the location. But of course, it's hard to beat some of these wild forests that we see as well around the world. So this is in Vancouver. This is Lighthouse Point Park on the north shore of Vancouver. And this is really a remnant, of course, of a very wild, very natural Pacific rainforest. So taking our kids there when we were living there was always quite an experience. For me, being Dutch, I'm not used to these big trees, of course, and then seeing this wonderful, huge wild nature, even on a small scale, is really very educational and very awe-inspiring in a way. It really gives you a humbling experience towards what nature does for us. And of course, you have your own wild nature. Also in Mumbai, the Sanjay Gandhi National Park is world renowned for being this green lung and this green resource in the city. And of course, there's also a lot of pressures on areas like this. There's always push for development or different uses, etc. And you get, of course, issues with wildlife wanders into the city, the occasional leopard, etc. So of course it comes with that. And we will have to live with nature if we really want to thrive as human beings. I have absolutely no doubt about that. In China, they do that a little bit differently. So they've lost, of course, a lot of their wild nature in the city. So they started creating these kind of tiny forests or forest parks where there's multiple tree species, layers, more natural vegetation. And some of the more traditional parks in cities like Beijing, in this case, they're actually being transformed into these more natural forest-like environments. So there's a trend really towards maybe more natural, more ecosystem-based, more multifunctional green spaces across the world. And then finally, we have to not forget that every single person probably interacts differently with forests. We all have our own stories of how we grew up and had our favorite tree, maybe at our grandparents' place, or we had our favorite natural area, our favorite forest. And people bring all that baggage, that psychological connection to trees with them as they move through life. So a nice case of this, or challenging case in some way, was in this forest in Surrey, which is a city south of Vancouver, where kids started bringing small houses to the forest and started creating what they call an elf forest or fairy forest, even making little doors in some of these old trees and so, which of course shows really nice commitment of the children to create the forest as their environment, but also create some challenges in terms of, for example, maybe having some garbage, but also some safety issues. Some of the older trees that have to be removed, but then there's all these little houses on them. People don't want them to be taken away. So imagination is important, and imagination also means you have to have bold, big visions. So one of the least green cities in the world, and I might almost let you guess, is Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, the capital of Saudi Arabia. It has only, I think, 1.5% green space and less than 1% tree canopy cover, where most cities in the world today, they're striving to have at least 20 or maybe even 30%. So Riyadh actually realized that they cannot just keep building on the oil industry. Global warming means the city is becoming almost unbearable, unlivable. So they start greening, and they have a multi-billion big greening projects where they start creating big parks, they start planting trees, they're using recycled wastewater in more efficient ways. And one of the things is really to try to move away maybe from having all these palm trees that don't really give so many benefits, maybe apart from the aesthetics and cultural benefits, and try to find trees that have bigger canopies, that cool the air more, that provide other ecosystem services. So strong imaginations, and of course it helps, as in this case, if there's a very strong hierarchical political structure, plus you also have the funding to follow up. But one of the really good things they've done in Riyadh, they brought some of the world's leading experts to help in this huge experiment of greening a city that's absolutely not green.